February 24th, 1945, Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, stared at the black-and-white photograph that had just arrived from international news sources. The image showed 6 American Marines raising their flag atop Mount Suribachi on the island of Iwo Jima. Though the battle still raged across the northern sections of the island, the Americans had captured the dominant terrain feature, the 546-foot volcanic peak that had been considered impregnable by its defenders. "This will be in every American newspaper tomorrow," said Colonel Takushiro Hattori, the operations officer who had brought the photograph to Umezu's attention. What struck Umezu wasn't just the captured mountain, but the sheer size of the American flag, a massive standard visible for miles across the tiny island and to ships offshore. It seemed almost deliberately oversized, a physical manifestation of American industrial might planted directly on Japanese territory for the first time in the war. The photograph represented more than the loss of a single mountain on a small sulfuric island. It symbolized a transformation that Japanese leadership had been reluctant to acknowledge. America's material superiority had evolved into an unstoppable force that was systematically dismantling Japan's defensive perimeter across the Pacific. For nearly 3 years since the triumph at Pearl Harbor, Japanese military doctrine had insisted that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. The Yamato Damashi, the indomitable Japanese spirit, would prevail against America's industrial might through superior fighting spirit, tactical excellence, and willingness to sacrifice. Yet the photograph before General Umezu told a different story. Despite extraordinary Japanese defensive preparations on Iwo Jima, the most elaborate of the war, with underground tunnels, concrete bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and fanatically dedicated defenders, the Americans had simply absorbed the casualties and continued advancing through sheer weight of materiel and manpower. The flag-raising photograph would become the most reproduced image of the war, appearing in newspapers and magazines across America. What most Americans saw was a symbol of inevitable victory. What General Umezu and the Japanese High Command saw was mathematical proof of inevitable defeat. This moment, when Japanese leadership confronted visual evidence of America's unstoppable advance toward their home islands, marked a psychological turning point in the Pacific War. The calculations of defeat were being written not just in casualty figures and production statistics, but in the symbolic image of a massive American flag planted on Japanese soil. The roots of this pivotal battle reached back to decisions made months earlier, as American forces pushed steadily across the Central Pacific toward Japan. October 10th, 1944. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the large wall map showing the remaining Japanese defensive perimeter. With the recapture of the Philippines underway under General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command, Nimitz's Central Pacific forces were planning the next steps in their island-hopping campaign. 2 small volcanic islands drew particular attention, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Both lay directly on the air route between American bomber bases in the Marianas and the Japanese homeland. Both would be fiercely defended. Iwo Jima first, Nimitz decided. It's smaller, closer to our current position, and taking it will provide emergency landing fields for B-29 bombers returning from Japan. This strategic calculation set in motion what would become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Though just 8 square miles in size, smaller than Manhattan, Iwo Jima held tremendous strategic value. Japanese fighters based there intercepted American bombers en route to Tokyo, while radar stations provided early warning of approaching raids. More significantly, as American B-29 Superfortress bombers began systematic attacks on Japanese cities, Iwo Jima became critical as a potential emergency landing field. Over 150 damaged B-29s would eventually land there during the final months of the war, saving the lives of approximately 2,400 airmen who would otherwise have been forced to ditch at sea. The Japanese High Command understood Iwo Jima's strategic importance equally well. In June 1944, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was appointed commander of the Iwo Jima garrison. An unusual choice for this critical assignment, Kuribayashi had served as a military attaché in America before the war and harbored no illusions about American industrial capacity. "America is the last country in the world that Japan should fight," he had written to his wife. "Their industrial production is beyond our comprehension." This clear-eyed assessment of American capabilities led Kuribayashi to develop a defensive strategy unlike any the Americans had previously encountered in the Pacific Campaign. Rather than attempting to stop the invaders at the beaches, a tactic that had repeatedly failed against overwhelming American naval gunfire, he would transform the entire island into a massive underground fortress. For nearly 9 months before the American invasion, Kuribayashi drove his men to dig. They created an extraordinary network of tunnels, bunkers, and concealed artillery positions, over 11 miles of underground passages connecting 700 pillboxes and blockhouses. Many were constructed with reinforced concrete thick enough to withstand direct hits from naval shells. Most innovative was Kuribayashi's defensive doctrine. There would be no banzai charges, no wasteful counterattacks. Every Japanese defender would fight from prepared positions and exact the maximum cost in American lives for each foot of volcanic soil. When a position became untenable, defenders would retreat through the tunnels to the next defensive line. "We will inflict maximum damage by killing 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier," Kuribayashi told his officers. "We cannot hope to win, but we can make America's victory so costly they will reconsider invading our homeland." This cold calculus of attrition represented a significant evolution in Japanese strategy, an implicit acknowledgement that material factors would ultimately decide the war's outcome. Kuribayashi could not prevent the fall of Iwo Jima, but he could make its capture so bloody that it might influence American planning for the invasion of Japan itself. By February 1945, Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima into what American military planners described as the most heavily fortified spot on Earth. 21,000 Japanese defenders waited underground for the inevitable American assault. Most expected to die. None expected to surrender. The American preparations matched this formidable challenge with overwhelming force. The invasion fleet comprised 450 ships carrying 70,000 Marines. Supporting this landing force were another 40,000 sailors and naval personnel. 800 aircraft would provide close air support. The mathematical disparity was stark. 70,000 attackers against 21,000 defenders, supported by the full industrial might of the United States. Yet American commanders harbored no illusions about the cost of capturing the island. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, predicted the battle would require 10 days and cost 15,000 casualties. Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, the senior Marine commander, thought these estimates optimistic given the island's formidable defenses. The material disparity between the opposing forces reflected the divergent industrial capacities of the two nations. By 1945, the United States was producing military equipment at rates that Japanese leaders found almost incomprehensible. American shipyards were launching 100 new naval vessels monthly. Aircraft factories delivered over 96,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone, nearly 4 times Japan's total production. This industrial advantage translated directly into operational capability. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima was the most concentrated of the Pacific War. 7 battleships, 21 carriers, and numerous cruisers and destroyers pounded the tiny island for 3 days. Carrier aircraft flew 2,647 sorties. Naval guns fired 21,000 American shells. Yet when the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they faced minimal resistance at first. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to hold their fire until the beaches were crowded with Americans. This tactical discipline produced devastating results when Japanese guns finally opened fire on the congested black volcanic beaches. The landings quickly became a bloodbath. The loose volcanic ash made movement difficult. Men and vehicles sank up to their ankles or wheels. Japanese artillery and mortars, pre-registered on landing zones, inflicted heavy casualties. By nightfall, despite landing 30,000 men, the Marines had advanced only a few hundred yards inland at terrible cost. This pattern continued for days. Slow, grinding advances measured in yards rather than miles, with every Japanese defensive position requiring direct assault by infantry, tanks, and flamethrowers. The casualties mounted at an alarming rate. By the 4th day, American losses had reached 4,500 killed and wounded, with minimal territorial gains. February 23, 1945, Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. Shortly after 10:30 in the morning, a 40-man patrol from E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, reached the summit of Mount Suribachi after a grueling climb up the steep volcanic slopes. Lieutenant Harold Schreier carried a small American flag attached to a length of Japanese water pipe, the only pole they could find. When this first flag was raised, it generated spontaneous cheering from Marines fighting below and from ships offshore. The symbolic importance of planting the American flag on Japanese soil was not lost on either the attackers or defenders. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, observing from a ship offshore, immediately recognized the flag's value as a morale booster. The raising of that flag means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years, he reportedly remarked. Concerned that the small first flag might be taken as a souvenir, commanders ordered a larger replacement sent up. It was this second flag raising that Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured in his iconic image, a photograph taken almost as an afterthought after he had missed photographing the first flag raising. The 6 men in Rosenthal's photograph, Michael Strank, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, Ira Hayes, René Gagnon, and Harold Schultz, became unwitting symbols of American resolve. 3 of them, Strank, Block, and Sousley, would die on Iwo Jima in the days following the flag raising. The photograph was rushed back to Guam for transmission to the United States, where it appeared in Sunday newspapers on February 25th. The American public's reaction was immediate and powerful. Here was visual confirmation of America's inevitable march toward Tokyo. For Japanese leadership, the image carried an equally powerful but opposite message. A sacred mountain on indisputably Japanese territory, not a colonial possession or mandate, was now crowned with the American flag. The defensive perimeter had been breached, not just militarily, but psychologically. General Kuribayashi, observing from his command post in the northern section of the island, understood the symbolic significance but remained focused on his mission of extracting maximum American casualties. Though Mount Suribachi had fallen, the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. The next phase would prove even more costly than the first. As Marines pushed northward from Suribachi toward the central airfield and beyond, they encountered the main Japanese defensive positions. The underground network that Kuribayashi had spent months preparing now demonstrated its lethal effectiveness. March 10, 1945. Northern Iwo Jima. Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Cushman, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, surveyed the devastated landscape before him. What had once been volcanic scrubland was now a cratered moonscape. Nearly every square yard had been hit by artillery shells, naval gunfire, or aerial bombs. Yet from this seemingly uninhabitable terrain, Japanese defenders continued to exact a terrible toll. Hidden spider holes revealed themselves only when their occupants fired. Artillery positions, connected by tunnels to ammunition dumps deep underground, could bombard advancing Marines, then quickly withdraw their guns to safety before counter-battery fire could silence them. "It's like fighting ghosts," Cushman told his company commanders. "We take ground during the day, but they infiltrate back at night through tunnels we don't even know exist." This spectral quality of the defense multiplied its effectiveness. Marines had to clear each bunker and tunnel entrance individually, often using flamethrowers and demolition charges. The fighting was intimate and horrific, frequently devolving into hand-to-hand combat in darkened tunnels. The casualties reflected this brutal reality. By mid-March, American losses had reached over 20,000, exceeding the entire Japanese garrison. Yet replacements continued to arrive, while the Japanese defenders received no reinforcements. The mathematics of attrition were working precisely as Kuribayashi had calculated, exacting maximum American casualties, but the outcome remained inevitable. The industrial disparity between the combatants was reflected in every aspect of the battle. When Marine Sherman tanks were disabled by mines or anti-tank weapons, replacements arrived within days. When Marine flamethrower operators were killed, others stepped forward with new equipment. When ammunition ran low, supply ships delivered more. By contrast, Japanese defenders had only what had been stockpiled before the invasion. No reinforcements would arrive. No supply ships would break through the American naval blockade. Each expended artillery shell, each deceased defender, represented an irreplaceable loss. This fundamental disparity was not lost on Japanese soldiers. Diary entries recovered from fallen defenders revealed growing awareness of their situation's hopelessness. Lieutenant Sugihara Jin wrote on March 1st, "The Americans can replace a destroyed tank in hours. We cannot replace a broken shovel." The battle's outcome was mathematically certain from the beginning. What remained in question was only the final cost in lives on both sides. The flag-raising photograph, transmitted globally while the battle still raged, both symbolized and accelerated this inescapable calculus. It showed not just military success, but industrial triumph. America's ability to project overwhelming force across vast oceanic distances and apply it precisely against Japanese defenses that had been years in preparation. For American civilians and military planners alike, the image reinforced confidence in inevitable victory. For Japanese leadership, it provided visual confirmation of a truth they had been reluctant to acknowledge. Spiritual factors alone could not overcome material disparity on this scale. As March 1945 progressed, both the physical battle on Iwo Jima and the psychological battle in Tokyo headquarters intensified. The Japanese High Command faced an increasingly inescapable reality. If a small, heavily fortified island like Iwo Jima could not be held against American assault, how could they possibly defend the home islands against the full weight of Allied military power? March 12, 1945, Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito studied the detailed situation reports from Iwo Jima with growing concern. The battle had entered its 22nd day, far longer than American commanders had initially predicted, but the outcome was now beyond doubt. Despite inflicting unprecedented casualties on the invaders, Japanese forces controlled less than a quarter of the island and were being systematically eliminated. How many Americans would we need to kill to make them reconsider invading our homeland? The emperor asked Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso. The question went to the heart of Japan's strategic dilemma. Japanese military doctrine had evolved from seeking decisive victory to simply making conquest so costly that the Americans might accept a negotiated peace. Iwo Jima was the test case for this strategy of attrition, and the results were not encouraging. "Your Majesty," Koiso replied carefully, "the Americans have thus far suffered over 20,000 casualties on Iwo Jima, yet they continue to advance. Their industrial capacity allows them to replace losses that would cripple our forces." This stark assessment reflected a transformation in Japanese strategic thinking. The early war years had been dominated by the belief that spiritual factors, Yamato Damashi, fighting spirit, and willingness to die, could overcome material disadvantage. By early 1945, this faith was colliding with the mathematical reality of American production capacity. In 1944 alone, American shipyards had produced 17 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, and countless landing craft. Aircraft factories had delivered over 96,000 military aircraft. Ordnance plants had manufactured over 40 billion rounds of ammunition. Against this industrial juggernaut, Japan had managed to produce only 16,693 aircraft in 1944, many of inferior quality due to material shortages and hurried training of replacement workers. The disparity in naval construction was even more pronounced. For every Japanese warship completed, American yards launched more than 20. These statistics were not merely numbers on paper. They translated directly into combat power on islands like Iwo Jima, where American forces could absorb casualties, replace equipment, and continue advancing, while Japanese defenders fought with dwindling supplies and no possibility of reinforcement. The battle for Iwo Jima laid bare this disparity in the starkest terms. American forces had landed 70,000 troops on an island with 21,000 defenders. When casualties mounted, replacements arrived immediately. When vehicles were destroyed, new ones appeared. When ammunition ran low, supply ships delivered more. For the Japanese defenders, each expended artillery shell and each fallen soldier represented an irreplaceable loss. No reinforcements would arrive, no supply ships would break through the American blockade. Defeat was not just likely, but mathematically certain. This realization had begun to penetrate the highest levels of Japanese leadership, while public pronouncements continued to emphasize spiritual strength and fighting spirit. Private deliberations increasingly acknowledged the fundamental material disparities that would determine the war's outcome. March 14, 1945, Underground Command Post, Northern Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Iwo Jima garrison, composed what he knew would be his final message to Imperial headquarters. After 25 days of the most determined resistance of the Pacific War, his force had been reduced to perhaps 3,000 effective fighters. American Marines now controlled more than 3/4 of the island. "The battle is approaching its end," Kuribayashi wrote. "Since the enemy's landing, the gallant fighting of the men under my command has been such that I am deeply impressed. I am sorry I have kept His Majesty the Emperor worried for such a long time. We have not been able to stop the enemy's landing. We have fought to the best of our ability, and we will fight to the last man." This message, transmitted by radio to Tokyo, contained no requests for reinforcement or resupply. Kuribayashi had never harbored illusions about potential relief. From the beginning, his strategy had accepted the inevitability of defeat, while seeking to exact the maximum cost from the attackers. The results had been tactically impressive, but strategically insufficient. American casualties had indeed exceeded the entire Japanese garrison, over 25,000 killed and wounded by mid-March. Yet this toll, while shocking by previous standards, had not deterred the American advance. The flag flying atop Mount Suribachi, visible from Kuribayashi's command post, stood as a constant reminder of the battle's inevitable conclusion. What Kuribayashi could not know was the broader impact of his defensive strategy. The unprecedented American casualties on Iwo Jima were causing military planners to recalculate the potential cost of invading the Japanese home islands. If 21,000 defenders on a tiny isolated island could inflict such losses, what might several million defenders achieve on Kyushu and Honshu? This recalculation would have profound implications in the coming months as American leadership considered alternatives to invasion, including the use of atomic weapons. But in March 1945, those decisions remained in the future. For now, the battle continued in its final, most desperate phase. The remaining Japanese defenders fought from increasingly isolated positions, often emerging at night, to infiltrate American lines before returning to their underground fortresses at dawn. Marine casualties continued to mount even as victory drew nearer. March 16, 1945. Washington, D.C. President Franklin D. Roosevelt studied the latest photographs from Iwo Jima, including Rosenthal's flag-raising image that had already become a sensation across America. The photograph had appeared on the front pages of hundreds of newspapers and would soon be used as the symbol for the 7th War Bond Drive. "This picture has captured something essential about the American spirit," Roosevelt remarked to his press secretary. "It shows what we can accomplish when our industrial might is guided by common purpose." The president understood the image's dual nature, both a genuine moment of military achievement and a powerful propaganda tool. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi represented more than the capture of a single hill. It symbolized America's inexorable advance across the Pacific, an advance powered by unprecedented industrial mobilization. Roosevelt had overseen this transformation of the American economy into what he called the arsenal of democracy. Under his leadership, the United States had achieved production miracles that would have seemed impossible before the war. The statistics were staggering. By 1945, American factories were producing a ship per day, an airplane every 5 minutes, and 50,000 tons of artillery shells per month. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant alone built one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. This industrial achievement translated directly into military power, projected across thousands of miles of ocean to islands like Iwo Jima. The flag atop Mount Suribachi stood as visual confirmation that America's production advantages had become decisive in determining the war's outcome. For the American public, the flag-raising photograph provided emotional validation of this industrial effort. The sacrifice of workers on assembly lines, the purchase of war bonds, the rationing of consumer goods, all were justified by the sight of Marines raising the stars and stripes on enemy soil. The image's power worked in both directions. In Tokyo, Japanese military leaders viewing the same photograph saw incontrovertible evidence that their defensive perimeter had been irretrievably breached. American forces were no longer attacking distant colonial possessions. They were standing on Japanese soil, raising their flag in triumph. This psychological impact extended beyond military calculations. The photograph directly challenged core tenets of Japanese wartime ideology, particularly the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. No amount of fighting spirit had prevented Mount Suribachi's capture. No sacrifice by defenders had stopped the American flag from flying over Japanese territory. March 26, 1945. Iwo Jima. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the summit of Mount Suribachi, surveying the devastated island below. After 36 days of the most intense fighting of the Pacific War, the battle was officially declared over. Though small groups of Japanese defenders would continue to fight from hidden positions for weeks, organized resistance had ceased. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue, Nimitz would later say, a tribute to the 27 Medal of Honor recipients from the battle, the highest number for any single American engagement. The cost had been staggering. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner, many of them Korean laborers rather than Japanese soldiers. The remainder fought to the death, following Kuribayashi's example of preferring death to surrender. American casualties totaled 26,038, including 6,821 killed. More Marines died taking Iwo Jima than in all previous Marine Corps battles combined. The invasion force suffered a 33% casualty rate, unprecedented for an American victory. Yet despite this terrible human cost, the battle's outcome had never been in serious doubt. The overwhelming material advantage deployed against the island ensured American victory, regardless of Japanese defensive skill or willingness to sacrifice. This mathematical certainty represented the fundamental transformation of the Pacific War. Japanese spiritual strengths, fighting spirit, tactical excellence, willingness to die, had been systematically overcome by American material advantages, industrial production, logistical capacity, technological superiority. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the iconic flag-raising photograph. The image captured not just a military achievement, but the triumph of an industrial system that could deliver overwhelming force to any point on the globe. For Japanese leadership, the photograph and the battle it symbolized forced a fundamental reassessment. If Iwo Jima, heavily fortified, fanatically defended, and considered sacred Japanese soil, could not be held, how could they possibly prevent the Americans from seizing the home islands? This reassessment would accelerate in the coming months as American forces captured Okinawa, an actual Japanese prefecture rather than merely a mandated territory, and began systematic firebombing of Japanese cities. The mathematical reality of defeat was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. April 1st, 1945, Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. General Yoshijiro Umezu presided over a comprehensive strategic review prompted by the fall of Iwo Jima. The session focused on Japan's capacity to resist an American invasion of the home islands, expected sometime in late 1945 or early 1946. "We must confront the material realities without illusion," Umezu told the assembled staff officers. "The Americans now control air bases within direct bombing range of our cities. Their naval forces operate with impunity off our coasts. Their production capacity exceeds ours by factors of 10 or more in critical categories." This stark assessment represented a significant evolution in Japanese strategic thinking. Early in the war, Imperial headquarters had emphasized qualitative advantages, better pilots, better tactics, fighting spirit, over quantitative factors. By April 1945, this faith in spiritual factors had been shattered by the mathematical reality of American production. The statistics presented during the review painted a grim picture. American shipyards were producing naval vessels at 10 times Japan's rate. Aircraft factories were delivering planes at a 7-to-1 advantage. Ammunition production exceeded Japan's by a factor of 15. Most alarmingly, Japan's ability to replace losses was deteriorating rapidly. Critical raw materials were increasingly unavailable as American submarines choked off maritime commerce. Skilled workers were in short supply as more men were drafted for military service. Bombing raids were disrupting industrial production across the home islands. Against these material disadvantages, Japanese planners could offer only one countermeasure: the willingness of the Japanese people to die in unprecedented numbers defending their homeland. The Ketsugo defensive plan for the home islands relied on mobilizing the entire civilian population, from school children to the elderly, to resist invasion. "We must make the Americans pay such a price in blood that they will accept a negotiated peace," one staff officer argued. "Iwo Jima demonstrated that we can inflict casualties at a rate of 1-to-1 or better. If we can kill enough Americans, they will reconsider the cost of conquest." This cold calculus of attrition represented the final evolution of Japanese strategy, from seeking victory to merely avoiding total defeat through the threat of unacceptable losses. Yet the experience of Iwo Jima suggested even this approach might prove insufficient. American forces had suffered unprecedented casualties on the tiny island, but had absorbed these losses and continued advancing. If they were willing to pay such a price for 8 square miles of volcanic rock, what price would they pay for the Japanese home islands? The flag-raising photograph that had appeared in American newspapers stood as visual evidence of this determination. The image showed not panic or hesitation in the face of casualties, but resolve, the same resolve that had transformed American industry into the most productive war machine in history. For Japanese leadership, the Iwo Jima flag had become a symbol not of American military prowess, but of American industrial might. It represented the mathematical certainty that spiritual factors alone could not overcome material disparities of such magnitude. June 22, 1945. Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito convened a Supreme War Council meeting as American B-29 bombers droned overhead in yet another daylight raid on the capital. The Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns were now complete, both ending in devastating Japanese defeats despite fanatical resistance. "We must consider whether continuation of the war remains in the national interest," the emperor stated quietly, breaking with his traditional role as ceremonial listener in such meetings. This extraordinary intervention reflected the transformation in strategic thinking that had accelerated since the fall of Iwo Jima. The flag-raising photograph had been only the most visible symbol of a fundamental shift in the war's dynamics. American forces were no longer fighting for distant islands. They were methodically assembling the staging areas for an invasion of Japan itself. The mathematical reality confronting Japanese leadership was stark and unyielding. American naval forces now included 98 aircraft carriers of all types, 23 battleships, and hundreds of cruisers and destroyers. This armada dwarfed Japan's remaining naval assets, which were immobilized in home ports due to fuel shortages and constant air attacks. In the air, American technical and numerical superiority had become absolute. Japanese aircraft production, once comparable to America's, had fallen to less than 15% of U.S. output. Critical aluminum shortages meant that even the planes that could be manufactured often used inferior materials, reducing performance and reliability. Most significantly, American bombers operating from Iwo Jima and other captured bases were systematically destroying Japan's industrial capacity. The strategic bombing campaign had reduced oil refining capacity by 83%, aircraft engine production by 75%, and overall industrial output by nearly 50%. Against these material realities, Japanese leaders could offer only spiritual counters: the fighting spirit of the Japanese people, their willingness to die rather than surrender, their absolute loyalty to the emperor, and the national essence. Yet Iwo Jima had demonstrated the limitations of even the most determined spiritual resistance against overwhelming material superiority. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi had become a mathematical equation that could not be solved through spiritual means alone. It represented not just a military defeat, but a fundamental challenge to the ideology that had sustained Japan's war effort, the belief that spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages. This challenge would grow more acute in the coming weeks, as American bombing destroyed Japan's remaining industrial capacity and a naval blockade reduced the population to near starvation. The mathematical certainty of defeat, first symbolized by the flag on Iwo Jima, would ultimately lead to surrender. August 15th, 1945. Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast crackled over radio sets across Japan. Following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the war, Japan's government had finally accepted the mathematical certainty of defeat. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable, the emperor stated. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. This acknowledgement of material realities represented the final transformation in Japanese strategic thinking. The spiritual factors that leaders had long believed would ensure victory. Fighting spirit, willingness to sacrifice, loyalty to the emperor had been systematically overcome by American material advantages. The path to this surrender had begun on Mount Suribachi, where 6 Marines raised the American flag in a moment captured for history. That photograph had provided visual confirmation of what Japanese leaders had been reluctant to acknowledge. No amount of spiritual strength could counter the material superiority that America had achieved. The statistics told the story in stark numerical terms. By war's end, the United States had produced 296,700 aircraft, 86,370 tanks, 648,000 naval vessels of all types, 20,500,000 rifles and carbines, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. This production miracle had overwhelmed Japanese spiritual strengths at every turn. At Iwo Jima, it had enabled American forces to absorb unprecedented casualties and continue advancing. In the strategic bombing campaign, it had delivered destruction on a scale that Japan could neither prevent nor match. In the naval blockade, it had deployed enough ships to strangle Japan's maritime commerce completely. The transformation from confidence to surrender had unfolded over 3.5 years since Pearl Harbor. In that time, American industrial mobilization had evolved from potential to reality, creating a war machine of unprecedented power. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi had symbolized this transformation, the moment when American material superiority became visibly, inescapably dominant. For the Japanese people, surrender brought a complex mixture of relief and despair. The war that their leaders had promised would end in victory had instead concluded with foreign occupation. The spiritual strengths that were supposed to ensure triumph had proven insufficient against material advantages. This realization would shape Japan's post-war development profoundly. The emphasis on spiritual factors that had characterized imperial ideology would be replaced by a focus on economic growth and technological development. Japan would rebuild itself not as a spiritual power, but as an industrial one. September 2nd, 1945. USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. The formal surrender ceremony took place beneath the massive 16-inch guns of the American battleship. As Japanese representatives signed the instrument of surrender, hundreds of American aircraft flew overhead in a display of continuing military power. Admiral William Bull Halsey had ordered this flyover specifically to remind the Japanese of the material superiority that had made their defeat inevitable. The aircraft filling the sky represented not just military victory, but industrial triumph. the visible manifestation of production capacity that had outbuilt Japan by margins of 10-1 or greater. On a bulkhead near the surrender table hung a special flag, the same stars and stripes that had flown over the U.S. Capitol on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. This symbolic connection between the war's beginning and end reinforced the transformation that had occurred in the intervening years. The Japanese attack had awakened American industrial potential. The flag raised on Iwo Jima had symbolized that potential fully realized. The surrender ceremony confirmed the mathematical certainty that this realization had created. For the Americans present, the ceremony represented the validation of their industrial achievement as much as their military prowess. The United States had not merely outfought Japan. It had outproduced it to a degree that made defeat inevitable, regardless of Japanese fighting spirit or tactical skill. For the Japanese representatives, the ceremony formalized a reality they had been confronting since the fall of Saipan and Iwo Jima: the inability of spiritual factors to overcome material disadvantages of such magnitude. The sight of American aircraft filling the sky above Tokyo Bay provided final confirmation of this mathematical truth. The iconic flag-raising photograph from Iwo Jima would soon become the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, cast in bronze at 1.5 times life size. The 6 figures raising the American flag would stand as a permanent reminder of both military courage and industrial triumph. More significantly, the image would influence Japan's post-war development. Having witnessed the decisive impact of American production capacity, Japanese leaders would redirect their nation's energies toward economic growth and technological advancement. The spiritual factors that had proven insufficient in war would be complemented by material development in peace. This transformation, from faith in spiritual strengths to acknowledgement of material realities, began with the sight of the American flag flying atop Mount Suribachi. That image, perhaps more than any other from World War II, captured the mathematical certainty that industrial capacity would determine modern warfare's outcome. The flag raised on Iwo Jima had not merely symbolized an American victory, it had announced a new era in which production statistics would matter more than fighting spirit, resource availability more than tactical brilliance, and industrial capacity more than willingness to sacrifice. For both victor and vanquished, this recognition would shape the post-war world and define the conflicts that followed. The lesson of Iwo Jima, that material factors ultimately determine military outcomes, remains relevant today, as nations continue to balance spiritual strengths against industrial capabilities in their pursuit of security and influence. The image of 6 Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi stands as a visual equation that transcends its specific historical context. It reminds us that in modern warfare, the mathematics of production can be as decisive as the courage of combatants, a lesson written in blood on the black volcanic sands of a small Pacific island in February 1945.